running Britain didn't seem that impressive anymore, and thus Canada's leaders began to openly question the powers these politicians had over their country. Even though on a day-to-day basis Canada functioned as a fully self-governing democracy, in theory, if Britain wanted to, they could still overrule the decisions of the Canadian government, so that made people a little bit anxious. In particular, there was growing anxiety over the fact that Britain seemed to enjoy using its settler colonies as tools in its foreign policy. During the early 1900s, thousands of Canadians were asked to fight and die to preserve British interests in two big wars. First, there was the 1899-1902 Boer War to quell a Dutch settler revolt in South Africa. And then came World War I, where 68,000 Canadians died fighting Britain's European enemies. Is this what Canada was for? William Lyon Mackenzie King was elected Prime Minister of Canada in 1921. Because of the First World War and a worsening economic situation in many parts of the country, particularly Western Canada, the Conservative government had grown very unpopular and was kicked out in a massive landslide. The new parliament was dominated by Mackenzie King's Liberals, as well as a bunch of new progressive parties devoted to economic and social reform. This meant that to get anything done, King had to do a lot of political wheeling and dealing. Here, let's watch this quick video from the Historica Canada Foundation that basically sums up what Canadian politics was like in those days.
I said it in the House and I say it now. Is it too much to ask?
My party does not have a majority in the Commons, Mr. Woodsworth, unless I have the support.
Is it too much to ask that Canada take care of poor people, 70 years of age, who built this country?
Well, you and Mr. Heaps are the Labour Party. You hold the balance of power. Perhaps in a coalition, I'm offering you a seat in cabinet, Mr. Woodsworth.
I'm on it, sir. But no.
Mr. Heaps, be my Minister of Labour?
Mr. King, I can't do that. But the Labour Party would support you on old age pensions.
In that case, it's not too much to ask, Prime Minister.
A lot of Mackenzie King's first term was dominated by those sorts of debates over the creation of new social programs, which isn't really the focus of this video, so we won't get into too much detail about that. But what's interesting for our purposes is how those debates wound up indirectly causing one of the single biggest spats between Canada and the UK. King ran for re-election in 1925, and the Parliament came back even more divided. After a few more months of wheeling and dealing, King decided that he had gotten tired of running the country this way. He said there should be another election, even though it had not even been a year since the last one. That was already a pretty dramatic request, but get this. In those days, final say on when Canadian elections could be held was up to Britain. Specifically, it was up to the British-appointed Governor of Canada, who in this case was a former British Army general named Lord Julian Hedworth George Byng, 1st Baron of Vimy, and Lord Byng said no to Mackenzie King. He said that if Mackenzie King was finding it too hard to run the country, well, he would find someone else who could. So on June 28th, 1926, Lord Byng appointed former Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Mahan, the man who Mackenzie King had beat in the 1921 election, back to power. And yeah, that lasted all of 3 days, because of course King's party and his allies, who together held a majority of seats in the Canadian Parliament, immediately voted non-confidence in this unelected Prime Minister. Only then did Lord Byng agree to hold the election. In the ensuing campaign, King demagogued very hard that Canada was a mature country that did not deserve to be subjected to these condescending colonial shenanigans from Britain anymore. Let me read you a passage from this book, Fights of Our Lives, Elections, Leadership, and the Making of Canada. For the first time, King found his true political voice, attacking with the bravura of a supple-minded man who for once believes himself to be on the right side of a clear-cut moral situation. In contrast to his usually cool, analytical approach to most issues, the Liberal leader saw Mahan's ascension as a matter of liberty versus tyranny. The royal colonial power was imposing a big business imperialist puppet on the people of Canada without an election. And it worked! King won a third term by a big margin. Shortly after King was re-elected, the British hosted a big summit in London of all of the prime ministers of all of the white settler colonies with the goal of restructuring the empire. Canada was not the only country that was frustrated with the way the British were running things. Ireland and white-ruled South Africa were getting pretty uppity as well, so there was a lot of momentum for reform. And in return, Britain was willing to grant some concessions. For one, they agreed to turn the governors of the white colonies into basically what they are now, which is powerless figureheads. Britain also agreed that the settler countries should be recognized as autonomous communities within the British Empire, as opposed to straight-up colonies like, say, India. But other than that, Britain's conservative government was not interested in conceding too much. In particular, they had not conceded the thing that King considered the most important, which was the right of the colonies to make independent foreign policy decisions. So when King got back to Canada, he decided to just do his own foreign policy stuff anyway, basically calling Britain's bluff. He created an independent Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and started appointing independent Canadian ambassadors to big important countries like America and France and Japan. Canada similarly began signing treaties with countries regardless of whether Britain approved or not, and for that matter, ignoring treaties that Britain had signed but King decided were not in the best interests of Canada. In 1927, he even got Canada elected to the Security Council of the League of Nations, which was the UN of those days. So in 1929, Britain hosted another summit of the white settler colonies, which were by now calling themselves the Commonwealth of Nations in order to distinguish themselves as something distinct within the empire. By this point, King's people were pushing really hard for maximum independence, and they weren't really facing much opposition anymore. Britain was now run by the Socialist Labour Party for the first time, which was very much in favor of loosening up the empire. The negotiations went on for months, but in the end, they agreed on the following. Britain would surrender all power to pass laws for Canada. Britain would no longer control Canadian foreign policy or military policy. Britain would no longer speak for Canada in any context, nor consider Canada its colonial possession. There were only a couple of exceptions. Canada would still regard the British king or queen as its ceremonial leader. Canada would still retain a symbolic British governor-general representing that king or queen. And perhaps most importantly, the Canadian Constitution could still only be changed by a vote of the British Parliament. We shouldn't overstate the significance of that last part, though. Britain probably would have given Canada the ability to change its constitution if it wanted, but at that time there was still a lot of internal political debate in Canada as to what a better system of amending Canada's constitution would be. A lot of politicians wanted Canada to have a system for changing its constitution that was like what they had in America, where a certain amount of states have to agree to constitutional amendments, but nobody could really seem to agree on what the good number would be. And as a result, Canada did not get this sorted out until the 1980s. In any case, King had secured for Canada something extraordinarily important: political independence from its former colonial master. British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald would later enshrine all of these promises into a big piece of legislation known as the Statute of Westminster, which has been called the Canadian Declaration of Independence. But back in Canada, other issues quickly overshadowed this achievement. 1929 was also the year that the Great Depression struck, causing millions of Canadians to lose their jobs. And just a few months after the Imperial Conference, Mackenzie King lost his bid for a fourth term as Prime Minister to the head of the Conservatives, R.B. Bennett. Bennett would proceed to run Canada for the next 5 years, causing an interruption in King's long term of office. So, King was elected back to power in a big landslide in 1935. Turns out old man Bennett wasn't that much better at dealing with the Depression than King was. By this time, events in Europe were starting to consume everyone's attention, and Mackenzie King thought that this would be a good opportunity for newly independent Canada to make its first confident steps into the international foreign policy scene. Unfortunately, the issue that King chose to make Canada's first great cause was appeasement of Nazi Germany. Today, King is usually considered to have been embarrassingly naive when it came to the Nazis, probably one of the single most delusional leaders of any Western country. In 1937, Prime Minister King went to Germany to visit with Hitler and was totally impressed. He thought Hitler was a great guy and totally bought into the Nazi perspective on the situation in Europe. As he put it in his diary, he is really one who truly loves his fellow man. Now, part of the reason that King might have liked Hitler was because that King, like much of the Canadian establishment of that time, was very anti-Semitic. King's immigration department in particular has a very dark legacy of hostility to Jewish refugees who were trying to flee Nazi Germany. Throughout the Nazi era, Canada was actually the single least welcoming Western nation to Jewish refugees. And at that time, that was something that a lot of Canadians would have considered something to be proud of. Anyway, when the Second World War finally broke out, it is safe to say that King was caught a little bit off guard. He had been in a lot of denial that Hitler presented any threat to anyone, but, even he couldn't escape reality forever. King had initially hoped to keep Canada neutral, but after Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in 1939, he felt that Canada's historic alliance with Great Britain obligated Canada to declare war as well. Now, Canada's role in the Second World War is like a huge topic that deserves its own video. For our purposes, the main thing to know is that Canada was a firm member of the Allies, and that hundreds and thousands of Canadian soldiers fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific.